All right. So good morning and thank you for joining us. I am Abby Burke, the Western Rivers Regional Program Manager for Audubon Rockies. Your webinar host this morning. Happy spring to you as we welcomed much needed precipitation across the state yesterday. I trust that you and yours are healthy and well. As we begin, I want to extend a round of thanks to you, our audience, and my co-panelists this morning for sharing the start of your day with us. Hopefully we are sharing a virtual coffee or maybe a cup of tea together as we gather online for our final session, number 3 of our legislator focused discussions on water. If you are new to our Water Legislator series, I'll offer a quick recap. Audubon is invested in healthy rivers and wetlands for birds and people. In years past, Audubon, Business for Water Stewardship, and partners have hosted an in-person Water Legislator breakfast. This year, with our unique and thankfully improving circumstances, we moved to online to keep water awareness momentum at the state capitol. Legislators, if you are able to, I invite you to identify yourself and say hello to panelists in the chat. And thank you for your service to our great state. Legislative staff and aides, I also invite you to say hello in the chat as well. Again, welcome to this morning's Water Legislator webinar on water quality. We had originally intended to cover water quality and equity with this webinar. However, each topic alone is far deeper than the time we have this morning. So we focused on water quality as a standalone topic for this morning. For the smoothness of webinar function, attendees have been muted and video sharing has also been disabled to preserve our connectivity. Please add questions to the chat box at any time. We will hold Q&A following all of our panelists' presentations. In order of presentation this morning, we will hear from Dr. Sarah Marshall, ecohydrologist with Colorado Natural Heritage Program, Melinda Casson, Senior Counsel from Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and Tricia Oweth of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Water supports the lives of every Coloradan and our environment every day. All of us depend on healthy flowing rivers, agricultural producers, cities and towns, businesses, recreation, and the environment. Recent rollbacks of federal clean water protections now leave 25% or more of state waters without environmental protections. The Federal Clean Water Protections Rule, known as the Trump administration's Navigable Water Protections Rule, took effect in Colorado on April 23rd of 2021 and substantially rolled back federal protections that were established in 2008, and even the protections established prior to that time. The substantial rollbacks leave upwards of 25,000 miles of Colorado streams at risk to pollution and construction impacts. It's estimated that 25 to 50% of our Colorado waters could be impacted by the rollback of these federal protections. Wetlands and streams provide critical habitat for Colorado's 400 plus species of birds. Regardless of their size or frequency of flow, they are connected to downstream waters and strongly influence their function. People, birds, and other wildlife gain many beneficial ecological services and functions from freshwater ecosystems. For example, Coloradans rely on clean drinking water from either surface water provided by rivers or groundwater. Freshwater ecosystems facilitate connections with both. I've asked key experts to present to you this morning about the connectivity of our water systems, how we arrived at this atrophied state of federal clean water protections for our water resources, and activity and trajectory of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to protect our now unprotected gap waters. Collectively as a state, from residents to decision makers, we need to lean in to learn more and participate in the decisions around our water resources. The decisions we make about water and river health impact all of Colorado. So we are privileged to have top water experts with us this morning. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Marshall to discuss the outsized importance of our waterways to their connectivity, to downstream processes. And so, Sarah, when you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Abby.
Mm.
I'm just going to share my screen real fast. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Abby, thank you for the eloquent introduction. And today I'm really going to focus on how the connectivity of headwater streams and wetlands is absolutely fundamental to water quality downstream. So to zoom out, most importantly, when we talk about things like wetlands, source water streams, groundwater, surface water, we're really talking about the fundamental source of our water, whether that's groundwater that enters up in the highest reaches of our mountains, in kettle ponds or fens, making its way down through bedrock and eventually emerging at the base of our peaks, or whether we're talking about surface water with something like snow melt collecting in our headwater streams at this time of year and causing flows to peak in streams ranging from the Poudre to the South Platte. And just to put this in context on a global scale, more than half of our global stream lengths are composed of these smaller headwater streams, often what we classify as ephemeral or intermittent streams. And those very streams that are so important to our water quality are some of the streams that are most at risk with the current definition of waters of the US. Headwaters and wetlands and streams form in specific locations for a reason. They're collectors of water from runoff to groundwater discharge and snowmelt, and they really function like the organs of our water system. They buffer water systems from pollutants like nitrate or phosphorus. They also help capture things like sediment, which I'll go into a little bit further in this slideshow. They also filter water and pollutants. So these systems really function a lot like our own bodies, whether that's our circulatory system, bringing nutrients and other essential elements to every single part of our watersheds, but also keeping us from harm and keeping our water clean. And these systems also perform disproportionately high ecological services for us relative to their very small extent on the landscape. So in the state of Colorado, our total wetland acreage is around 1.2 million acres. So that's actually a little bit less than 2% of the land area in our state. So combined, these wetlands and streams benefit millions of people living downstream in many states, from drinking water to irrigating our food crops. And along the way, they provide critical wildlife habitat and refuge for more than 80% of wildlife species in our state. And as I mentioned earlier, these wetlands really are like our circulatory system and our system that helps clean waste. And here's just an example. This is in the Arkansas headwaters of what this connectivity looks like at a very large scale in our watersheds. And as you can see, these are comprised of a variety of kind of a circulatory system. So we have our streams and things that are immediately connected in the headwaters, but we also have a variety of wetlands that at first glance don't appear to be connected to our rivers and streams. So we have things like kettle ponds or fens that are in depressions. But the most important piece of all this is that even those quote unquote disconnected features actually are typically connected to streams, whether that's on a 10-year timescale with groundwater or whether that's even on a seasonal timescale. So really, when you zoom out, it is all connected. When we look at features like floodplains, which are also quite the topic of discussion with the waters of the US coverage right now, in the current rule, floodplain wetlands that do not have a direct surface water connection to streams have lost protection. And for those of us that study rivers and streams and wetlands, that runs counter to the science. So around riverscapes, which are including floodplains, riparian vegetation, adjacent wetlands, channels that may be active for 2 weeks out of the year, or even sometimes every 5 years or every 10 years. All of these features are connected, whether that's by groundwater, which moves at a faster rate between those features and streams than it may move in adjacent landscapes. And they're also dynamic. So these features are constantly on the move. And as someone who maps these features, they're really hard to keep track of. So this system is fundamentally based on mapping and other documentation that is constantly in flux. So they're very hard to regulate, and it's better to just assume that they're all connected. Our riverscapes and other wetlands function like sponges. So they, as I mentioned earlier, really intercept water and sediment during floods and snowmelt. And then they slowly recharge groundwater and meter out water during the rest of the year, which, if you're an agricultural producer downstream, that's really important. So not only do you not want sediment in your headgate, but you also want to have your snow melt stored and gradually released so that you have water later in the season. Another example of this that we Coloradans are very familiar with is the role of these wetlands in water quality during and following fires. So during a fire, wetlands provide critical fire breaks and buffers for our rivers and streams and our water supply. They also provide refuge for wildlife and plants. One recent study looking at 5 large wildfires in the West found that the greenness, or these riverscapes around streams and rivers in areas like beaver complexes, they were about 3 times greener after a fire compared to systems that did not have these connected floodplain wetlands. After a fire, these systems are fundamentally important to moderating runoff, to capturing sediment that could otherwise go into our drinking water reservoirs, to providing habitat, and also providing a source of plants to recolonize burned areas. And I provided just a few images showing this lush wetland vegetation after a fire. And finally, one of the most important pieces of all of this, it's a simple fact, but these features have to be in good condition to provide the highest levels of functions and services for our water quality downstream. We can't simply abuse them and expect them to keep performing at such a high level to keep us safe, to keep us with clean water, and to keep us all moving forward and resilient in a future that is warmer, drier, and full of things like drought and earlier snowmelt. On that note, there is a huge body of literature on the connectivity of wetlands and streams, including the quote unquote geographically isolated wetlands. I included a QR code that was from a really important review that the EPA did in 2015 on the connectivity of streams and wetlands. I've also provided some references on more recent literature. So please don't hesitate to follow up with me if you have questions about any of this. And otherwise, I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Sarah, thank you so much. What a great overview. I really appreciate the time in your presentation and the research preparing for it. So thank you again. With this, Melinda, I'd love to turn it over to you for your presentation on our federal rollbacks and the timeline that got us to where we are today.
Sorry, I can't see the part of.
Sure. If you hit your slideshow, Melinda, I think you'll.
Yeah, I can't. That button is covered by. There you go. Okay. Found a different way. All right. First of all, I'm Melinda Casson. I'm senior counsel for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I've been doing water quality and other kinds of water law since I started at the state of Colorado Attorney General's office representing the water quality control agencies decades ago. That's enough of a reference. So my job here is to spend 10 minutes talking about how we got here from a legal standpoint. And of course, everything starts with the Clean Water Act, because this is all about the Clean Water Act, which is a federal statute. The scope of the Clean Water Act in the statute is navigable waters. And then navigable waters, which are places where you can put boats, is defined as waters of the US. So one of the reasons that we have these problems is that to the average reader, navigable and waters of the US are not the same thing. So just keep that in mind as we're rolling through this. We've had 3 Supreme Court cases trying to interpret what this means and what the scope of the Clean Water Act is. In 1985, so about 12 years after the Clean Water Act was passed, the Supreme Court said navigable waters must include their adjacent wetlands. And of course, there may be lots of critters, including fish, in wetlands, but there are not boats. So that was the first step. 15 years later, in another case, the Supreme Court said, but they went sort of the other way. Navigable must mean something. And they invalidated a policy that had included as wetlands isolated gravel ponds. So not the kind of thing Sarah was talking about, but human dug depressions that migratory birds might use on their way to and from wherever they go. And so it wasn't a regulation even, it was just a policy. And the Supreme Court said, that's a bridge too far. That can't possibly be navigable waters. And then 5 years later, 15 years ago, the Supreme Court looked at this again and said there's 9 Supreme Court justices. There were 5 opinions in this case, so they couldn't exactly agree, and you ended up without 5 justices, which is the majority, signing on to the same rationale. So you ended up with 2 different rationales. One was you needed continuous flow between a wetland and a navigable water eventually, or you needed continuous flow from a little tributary, the headwater streams that Sarah was talking about, and a more permanent water. That was one interpretation. And then the other one was, as long as there's a significant nexus, and you think back to her map, a significant nexus between all the little wetlands and all the little streams, that would be enough. So that for all of you who are actually doing legislation and trying to interpret legislation, messy drafting leads to messy implementation. There was a 1986 rule, and I'm not going to read it here, but if you read it on the screen, this is where the navigable must mean something, because a lot of the things in here seemed to the average reader not to be close enough. But that was the rule from really after the Clean Water Act was passed up until the Supreme Court case in 2005. So you have this very broad rule, which has always been on the books. And in 2008, the agencies issued guidance to interpret the rule. And they said, we're going to take anything that fits into either one of these opinions, the continuous flow or the significant nexus. And in 2015, the agencies rewrote the rule, and they chose basically to rely on significant nexus, and they based their decision on the science, which was a connectivity report that was 450 pages long and cited 1,500 articles, the kind of thing that Sarah was talking about. And between the 2008 guidance and that rule was probably less than a 5% expansion of what constituted waters of the US. So, as you know, in DC, pendulums swing, and the pendulum then sharply swung back. And there was another agency rewrite in 2020, so last year. And that agency rewrite jettisoned the science part and said, well, we're going to interpret the legal language of the statute. And they decided not significant nexus, but they were going to rely exclusively on continuous flows, which means semi-permanent tributaries, but not the streams that run in response to a rainstorm or snowmelt runoff, and not the wetlands that are groundwater fed, like fens or prairie potholes. And that the wetlands needed to be abutting, which means physical contact, as opposed to adjacent in the area. So a much stricter interpretation. This is the, these are maps, one done by TU, one done by TNC. The one with more red is the percent of streams at risk by watershed as a result of this change. And you'll see the San Luis Valley, which is sort of all wetlands, is particularly affected. And then all the little ephemeral washes on the plains where you have, they run because there's a rainstorm, there's a thunderstorm in the summer. Those are the kinds of streams, when Abby started out saying at least 25% of streams and wetlands will no longer be covered under this rule. We've got estimates anywhere between 25% and 50% for streams, or 25% and 40% for wetlands. And these are real places. Windy Gap, which has got all of its permits and is, the Windy Gap firming project, the new reservoirs, Glade Park, that are going to be built there. When Northern was doing that project back in the 2000s, they were talking to the Forest Service, and the Forest Service asked them to take all of the sites where they might build a reservoir that had wetland fens off the table, because fens are so important from an ecological standpoint, and they did. So they avoided wetlands. Whitney Reservoir, which is a reservoir that's on the table right now that Aurora's thinking about. Aurora's actually been doing experiments to see whether they can move a fen, because they understand they don't want, these are super important from an ecological standpoint. And even though they're no longer protected because they're groundwater fed, so there isn't a continuous surface flow, as good stewards of the land, the developers are saying, all right, well, maybe we don't want to go there. Can we protect these fens? The last one, this is a speculative project that I don't know will ever get built, but Red McCombs, who's a Texas developer, wants to build 850 housing units at the top of Wolf Creek Pass, and has land to do it. It's an inholding in the Forest Service, and the original JD is a jurisdictional determination. The original idea was no, it's not going to be a big deal, but then the Forest Service allowed a road to go in there, which cut off the wetlands from the stream, and so the potential is a lot more. So that's just these are real issues. And so now we get to what can the state do if the federal government isn't going to protect, or if the state just wants to have sort of a baseline that stays throughout the political swings back and forth. The state could protect wetlands all by itself. And that hasn't happened in part because you have the federal government doing most of this work. But that last line down there, the Clean Water Act says that Congress recognizes in the Clean Water Act that states have the primary responsibility to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution. And a lot of the reason that the state doesn't act is that you've got the feds, and a lot of reason that the states don't ask is these programs are expensive. It's expensive to go out there and see what people are doing. It's expensive to verify. So, those of you who are in the legislature and who are on all of Abby's blogs and stuff, you see that the state legislature is thinking about this. And the answer to the other question, won't the pendulum swing back, is yes. The Biden administration has already said they're going to rewrite this, but Trump ran on changing this, and it took 3.5 years for him to get a new rule in place. So the fact that the Biden administration says they will rewrite, it's not like help is on the way. It's going to be, there's going to be a stakeholder process and then all of these other agency things. So it will take several years. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Tricia.
Melinda, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here just for a background. And Melinda, thank you again for that great outline. It's certainly been a windy path to get us to where we are today in the federal landscape of water protections. So appreciate you very much for that presentation. And with that, Tricia, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks, Melinda, for teeing that up so well. So to those of you who I have not met, my name is Tricia Oates. I am a policy advisor at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. We, among other things, really work on water quality protection in the state of Colorado. Like Melinda, I'm also an attorney, although I have not been working on waters of the US for quite so many decades, but it has been close to a decade now. This is a really, really important issue. You know, we at CDPHE think it is absolutely critical that the state of Colorado protect these waters. And so, you know, Melinda kind of set this up pretty well in the sense that the state can protect these waters that used to have protection under federal law, but do not anymore. And we have been working with stakeholders on a bill that would allow us to issue permits and for dredge and fill activities in what we call these gap waters. So the gap waters are those waters that used to be protected, but no longer are under the rule passed by the Trump administration. We have been working at this for a long time. We started monthly stakeholder meetings last May, so a year ago after the Trump rule was published. During that time, we worked on developing a white paper with the stakeholders, and essentially that we were able to come to consensus with all of the stakeholders on trying to define what are the gap waters, which waters continue to be waters of the US, which waters never were waters of the US, and which waters are these gap waters, you know, that we feel like the federal government is no longer protecting and we as a state need to be protecting. And in those conversations, we were very clear that if that the navigable waters protection rule, if the Trump rule became effective in Colorado, that we would need a gap waters program here in Colorado in order to continue to protect those same waters and maintain the status quo of what has been protected. And then we kicked things into higher gear with stakeholder meetings and have been meeting weekly since the middle of March. We've been meeting weekly with the Colorado Water Congress to discuss this issue and answer questions about our proposed solution. We've been meeting, we've had over a dozen small group and one-to-one meetings with stakeholders, and we've gotten a lot of really good comments and feedback. And we've been providing written response to all of those comments on our website and making modifications to a draft bill in response to feedback and suggestions that we've gotten. We've made extensive adjustments to the draft bill in response to that because we think it's critical both to protect our state waters, but also because we do want projects to be able to move forward. And so, for example, we got some feedback from Northern Water you know, and we made some adjustments, like explaining in the language that this program would only apply if and when there is a gap. So if and when the Biden administration does pass a new rule, and if it closes that gap and the federal government continues to protect those gap waters, then the state program would cease to exist. You know, it wouldn't need to continue. We're not looking for duplicative protection or anything that's overly burdensome. We're just looking to make sure that we're protecting these waters, whether it's us or the federal government. We also, have made some other changes about grandfathering projects that had a valid permit from the federal government before the Trump rule went into effect. Some language explaining that, the program cannot impair water rights. We also made some changes in response to comments from the Colorado River District to really talk about how are we going to deal with ditches. And that's really important to our agricultural community as well. We got some comments from the city of Fort Collins, and we made some changes in response to that. We had initially thought that we, in terms of jurisdictional determinations that had been issued by the federal government, we are comfortable, honoring those. But we had initially thought only if they were unexpired. But after talking through that with the city of Fort Collins, we made some changes and said, well, even if it's expired, as long as the conditions have not really changed, then that analysis, we feel that we would feel comfortable still relying on that analysis. So despite this extensive work, where we stand right now, we have not yet been able to get this bill moving forward. And we're in a place where this could really impact a number of projects, a number of construction projects, and other construction or other maintenance activities in the state. Because if they can't get a permit from the state, and they know that they can no longer get a permit from the federal government because it's no longer waters of the US, then it's illegal for them to do that dredge and fill activity. And so they're kind of stuck. And so we continue to believe that the programmatic bill that we've been working on is the right path forward. But if it doesn't move forward, we're going to be in this place where we really have no choice but to be exercising enforcement authority for those kinds of activities that move forward and don't have a permit. And so we, again, we continue to recommend that Colorado implement the state dredge and fill program, but we really feel like we can't wait for the Biden administration before we protect our state waters. We know that that's a priority for the new federal administration, but as Melinda said, it takes a long time to figure out what the right words are. And they've already indicated they're not going to just adopt the rule that the Obama administration did. They're going to take a fresh look at it, and so that's going to take a while. And even once they do pass it, it's likely to be subject to additional litigation, just like all of the past rules have been. And so, we suspect it's going to be quite some time before there's a new rule affecting Colorado. And so we don't feel like we can wait that long to protect waters here in Colorado. And so with that, I think I will stop and open it up to questions.
Great, Tricia, thank you very much. We'll open up for a couple of questions and answers here in just a moment. Panelists, I just wanted you to be thinking about any final thoughts you might have at the conclusion of our questions section with this. But some of the questions that I have seen come in, apologies, I'm going to peek at my chat here. And with interesting, there's a question that if the legislature doesn't act, can anything be done by executive action? Would there be any panelists like to comment on that?
Well, I can take a shot at it. This came up in one discussion that we've had, and I'm not sure if the question is asking, by executive action, could there be a way to allow the activities to move forward or to redefine waters of the US. But in any event, I don't see a path forward for like an executive order or otherwise to address this. It's a statutory issue and a regulatory issue, and so I don't see a path forward that way.
Mhm.
Abby, thank you, Tricia. Let me step in because this is also related to a couple of the other questions that I've seen in the chat. So what the state of Colorado has now is a program that regulates what we call point source discharge permits. So permits that if you've got a factory or a wastewater treatment plant or a little mine somewhere and they have a pipe that takes treated effluent to the river, the state regulates those now, and the state program covers all of the waters of the state. So both what the federal government thinks and the gap water. So that kind of discharge is currently regulated by the state. What we're talking about here is what under the Clean Water Act is the other kind of discharge. And that's basically thinking about construction, dredge and fill materials. Whenever you've got a bulldozer that is scooping things up and putting them in the river, and that can be for a bridge abutment or for building a dam or for cleaning out or changing an irrigation structure. Those kinds of things, dredge and fill material, are at the federal level regulated by the Corps of Engineers. And then at the state level, only 3 states in the country have ever had dredge and fill programs. Colorado is not one of them. So when Tricia talks about filling the gap and having, and we need a state program to protect against discharges of dredge and fill material, what that means is construction debris and dirt. That's the program that Colorado doesn't have. That's the program that Colorado would need to set up to protect these waters, which as of April 23rd have no longer been protected from that kind of discharge in the state.
Thank you, Melinda. Absolutely. I'm seeing a number of comments from folks who are informed citizens about how can citizens enable action to happen to get this as a priority for our legislature to take action. Do we have thoughts from the panel on that? I have my own thoughts, but I'll run sweep on that.
Yeah, Abby, why don't you talk? You have a blog on this, so send people there, and they can, and they do what's there. That would be a way of letting their voices be heard, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I will just jump in as moderator's privilege here with that. And absolutely contact your state representatives and senators and say that this is a priority for you. There is a tremendous amount of complexity in this issue, and our webinar this morning and the blogs that Melinda has alluded to and thankfully also helped review and to edit for me are hopefully ways that we can help demystify some of the complexity and allow the public as well as legislators to participate in an informed way to protect these waterways that are critical not only for wildlife and fish, but for people as well. We depend on healthy natural systems far more than we are able to even evaluate with that. So please do contact our state leadership and let them know that this is a priority for you and why. And in my follow-up email to registrants, and potentially you also saw this in my invitation to this webinar this morning, there are links to further information there, but I'll make sure as we circulate the recording for this morning that you also have the links to these blogs and additional information to really elevate this as a key issue, particularly in the light of an extended drought, long-term aridity, wildfire, not only aftermath of wildfire recovery, but also in preparation and creating resilience on our landscapes so that wildfires are not as impactful or detrimental to our watersheds. So there's a number of high key important topics that what we're discussing this morning hits upon. So please do let your state leadership and your representatives and your senators know that this is a priority to you. Okay, sorry. Any other comments on that particular angle as far as citizen engagement?
Abby, I put your blog in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I would briefly add as well, we at the Heritage Program work quite a bit with watershed groups around the state and land trusts. And I think there are a lot of really phenomenal opportunities, including ones that these women are involved with basin roundtables around the state, but also watershed groups as well that work together to prioritize areas for protection and restoration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sorry, there's some really great questions here. I'd love to offer us another question to consider. What is the timing of a bill with not much time left in the session, and what happens if we don't get a bill this session? Can I open that up?
Well, if a bill does not move forward, then I think from the state's perspective, what that means is that we won't be able to provide permits for the kinds of construction activities and maintenance activities that result in dredge and fill activities in our streams and wetlands. And so that means that either those kinds of projects can't go forward or they will go forward and the state will have to be evaluating whether to take enforcement action against them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I know we're running a little close to time, but I wanted to pause for a moment and see if panelists, if you had any final words as we begin to wrap up our session this morning.
Abby, I think I said what I needed to say. This is a very wonky topic and it's very intimidating, and we don't come to the legislature very often. So most legislators also don't understand, they've not had to dig deep and learn these things. So if you do contact your legislators, ask that they do something, but also understand that if this is a brand new issue for them, and it will be for many, that don't expect them to already know everything that you learned here or that you've learned, because I know there's some people in this group who already know a lot about this. It is not something that the legislature deals with very often, so they need a lot of contextualization to understand why it matters and why they need to act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Melinda. And, just to maybe expand just a little bit on some of the conversations I've had with folks around the state, I have found that in conversations, whether it's the Audubon membership or the informed public, illuminating what the rollbacks of federal clean water protections actually mean to our state, and the current status of 25% or more of Colorado waterways at risk to pollution or development. Coloradans quickly become very upset that action has not yet been taken by the legislature, and that there's personally, there's just too much at stake from our 18 billion annual water-based recreation economy to favorite paddling spots, to favorite birding spots that are potentially at risk now. The overwhelming response that I receive is that how has this happened to our water and in our state? And people certainly do stand ready to take action to help protect wetlands, streams, and rivers from development. So with that, I'd like to certainly honor our time. Recordings from this morning will certainly be circulated to everyone who has registered for this event. We had about 150 registrants and about 60 of you all that joined us this morning. So a recording will be distributed shortly of today's presentation. But to honor your time, we will conclude this morning to allow legislators to have a few moments before heading to the floor. But please remember, water moves and sculpts everything it touches. I hope you found the information presented this morning useful and that it has helped you grow in your appreciation and awareness of our water resources. I welcome your feedback and thank you again for joining us this morning. Have a wonderful day and rest of your week. Thank you, panelists, for your time this morning. Appreciate you. Take care.